This recording is going to probably sound a bit oxymoronical and inconsistent in terms of how all over the place I am on these sort of different subjects and sort of mashing them together perhaps in an unsavory concoction to some people's evaluation. But anyway, my path into, I don't know how to say this. I guess let me be blunt. I have in a strange relationship with the field of Scientology, with the topic of Scientology, um, in part because of my belief or sense of being about sort of my implicit intimacy with the subject. Um, anyway, this is going to be quite a strained introductory uh, uh, lead into to the subject matter that I want to get to. So I guess let me just say this plainly, in some sense. The topic that I've just made a recording on, which has to do with the subject of morality and ethics and justification, and talking about sort of secular structures and law and things like that. Scientology as an organization, as a field, as a church, as the Church of Scientology, essentially, as far as I can tell, has one blight that it suffers from, and this blight is somewhat relatively justified in its existence in terms of that it is a self-caused um, illness, and in some sense, the identity of that cause is, I believe, it's me. So just imagine how confused this lead into this very complicated matter is. That essentially the policy document keeping Scientology working is a necessary policy. Uh, it's relatively justified. It's rational. It's rational and it's necessary. But it's not objectively justifiable. And that's very problematic. And in the recording that I just made prior to this, when I sort of go into this issue of the gap between and in some sense the also the necessary understanding that we can know for certainty when we fall beyond certain bounds of what is objectively justifiable, but we cannot know, in some sense, beyond those bounds, uh, in a immediate scenario or an immediate set of experience and an immediate track of evaluation that we have, safeguarded the honor thereof and continue to administer diligently and forthrightly, um, with an honest heart and a clear mind. We cannot know the difference between relative justification and objective justification, but we can know when we fall short of objective justification, essentially. We can know sometimes that, for sure, but in some sense can never go past the the more humble claim, in some sense, that uh, this appears to be relatively justified. In some sense, we can never sort of escape that category, although we must still endeavor, I guess, to be in pursuit and vigilant towards the sensitivity and towards the goal of achieving objective justification. So that is how we are correctly orientated in terms of morality. That we know that ethically we can only ever be relatively justified, but morally we must be orientated towards what is objectively justified or objective justification. And then we've got all of our ducks in a row. Okay, so that's something of what was being explored in the last recording, and speaking about how the South African constitution, the South African legal system has been somewhat polluted and betrayed and poisoned by a mixing of institutionalized corruption, but also sort of judicial oversight in the sense that it has been an overdevelopment of something that has turned the apple cart over. The oversight of the development of pathological jurisprudence and legal theory. Pathological in the sense meaning immoral and amoral. Immoral on the level of ethics and amoral on the level of morality. And also unconstitutional in the sense that it completely betrays both the spirit and the structure in the Constitution. Anyway, I'm talking about Scientology here. So, in some sense, this is all the more complicated for me because when I'm running up against how I want to treat the subject, which is in some sense integrated with the research that I have done in my current life, which is now in a form in which I can have a go at creating a proper synthesis between Scientology and my new research and reintegrating them, perhaps. This in Scientology would essentially be referred to as squirreling, mixing my own practice, and in some sense I cannot disassociate my own practice from my evaluation of the data itself. In Scientology. So in some sense, either if I'm to be branded a squirrel, then I cannot properly study Scientology, or I won't be necessarily welcome or permitted within the field, at least within the organizational perimeter of the church. But in some sense, it's doubly complicated that, in some sense, because keeping Scientology working is objectively not justified, it is only justified in the vogue of the prerogative of the person who issued the policy, which I believe was me in a former life. So in some sense, I'm running against the prerogative of myself from a past lifetime. Increasingly annoying. And in some sense, a lot of this will then seem doubly strange to people listening to this, that, and I want to get into this in terms of the subject matter, in terms of already some of my tentative synthesis between some of these matters, is, I do think I have roughly recapitulated the whole field of Scientology within this new model, which is somewhat more holistic, I would say, and it is something of taking everything into account from the seventh dynamic. In some sense, it's a recapitulation of the whole field from the seventh dynamic. And in some sense, and this is something that I might even have to refine in myself, that I still need to work on or work out what the synthesis of this is. But I don't have, in my own thinking, I have never strived to discriminate and or to distinguish between frequencies of thinking or threads of thought which pertain to the genetic entity and threads of thinking that pertain to the thetan. That the languaging of my mind is always the thread of the thetan, but the record of memory, the in some sense, yeah, I guess I haven't even philosophically conceived of this properly. That there is something very clearly in my modeling of things that would relate to the genetic entity, but as far as I can see, it's a yeah. I mean, I guess I haven't given this philosophically enough thought, but it's the past reference of the work of a thetan at some point. So in some sense, it's the kind of uh, it's a second witness perhaps to the thetan, and it bears record um, of the thetan in its own. But anyway, I guess I still need to think about sort of the data that corresponds to this perhaps, and work out how to integrate it. But what I also find weird about it is anyway, there are too many facets of sort of so in some sense I do think that a lot of my models can find some point of analogous agreement with, for example, the history of man, technique 80. But again, I guess I should see. This is why it would be so much easier for me to be able to talk to people that were much more proficient in the technology, because then I could just work out what the latest synthesis of that line of thinking was, and then compare that to my models. Um, but in some sense, I've got a prime model which is such a wonderful synthesis. But anyway, when I was going through sort of the Technique 80, the History of Man book, which is in some sense, or at least half of it, is a history of the genetic entity, or the somatic mind, or something like that, and the idea that there are two independent units of thought, and in some sense that just mirrors too much my green sequence and red sequence within the 17 model. And there's a very interesting thing in which the eighth dimension of psychological reality, or the eighth cognitive function in the hierarchy of that 17 model, and in some sense from 1 to 8 there is a high correspondence between, in 1 to 8, the 8 dynamics. There's a huge almost overlap between the 8 dynamics and dimensions 1 to 8 within the 17 model. But the 8th dimension has this very sort of unifying sort of thing about it, which would allow for, in some sense, is very much similar to the concept of the earth in the Bible, but also perhaps to Gaia in the Greek sort of religion. It has a kind of metaphorical kind of link to pantheism in some sense. And it's interesting because in terms of how the genetic entity is explored, I wonder if it isn't in some sense connecting via the eighth dimension of psychological reality in my model into the experiences, the somatic experiences of other beings, so that it can somewhat sort of physically integrate its physiological circuitry into a kind of reptilian brained correspondence symbolism, so that at some level of functionality in terms of cerebral sort of propitiation, uh, that in some sense you could perhaps ground this into a protoform of neuroscience and get out of, in some sense, the identification of protoplasm as the conduit of GE, of the genetic entity sort of subtraction. That in some sense the genetic entity sort of entrails that are traversed in the history of man are very useful metaphors, in that they are the operative metaphors that the mind has conceived of in one's cognitive appraisal. That essentially that the eighth dimension of psychological reality is something like the reptilian brains, and I'm really saying this in the vaguest possible sort of proto neuroscience language that I can kind of intimate, because I'm not very well read on neuroscience, and neither do I wish to be, because I think that as a field it is fundamentally it needs to be understood metaphysically before it can you can try to seek the answers by somewhat prodding the physiology and trying to make measurements and such. You have to already know what you're looking for, or you're just going to mislead yourself. So you really have to have quite a robust metaphysical structure before you can start to align it with physiological symptoms, and at a higher level of functioning, which is in some sense, I would say, related to the shadow networking of the large spectrum of trigger, in which, I don't know all, I can't, Penrose goes into this very wonderfully with his neuroscience friend when they talk about essentially the huge amount of play in the bandwidth within which it might trigger or it might not trigger. The brain is not a push button serial connection of sort of it's not a computer. It's very clearly not a computer. That in some sense whether there are chains of whether there are chains of functioning or not is all hinged on, I would say, the capacity bound within what is generally referred to as faith or intuition, um, or reasoning as well. The capacity. So, in some sense, the I would hazard that the actual material components that correspond to the spectrum of variance in which the neuron triggers or not, or doesn't. And then in network, all of those propensities then are kind of in the shadow conflated into a single creative capacity. Anyway, so obviously that in some sense is already gated and filtered by, if I can just metaphorically refer to it as reptilian symbolic metaphor, in terms of how the actual physiological circuitry and regulatory uh, uh, chains of propitiatory functionality are aligned and coordinated internally. All of those structures all of those structures in some sense I think are properly, let's say, transcended when uh, when all of the dichotomous blocks of in some sense the hardest part of, let's say, higher ordered thinking, or even you're sort of in the realms of probably operating Thetan and such, is that not only dispersals but also flows. That there's one flow that is a dichotomy, and that there are three dispersals, which are each of them dichotomies, but they are all dichotomies of a different nature and of a different kind and of a different uh, nature of resolving them in some sense, which are peculiar to that dimension of psychological reality, to put it that way. And so to navigate those uh, hazards um, and keep your sort of your thetan intact and not in some sense subservient to the genetic entity or something like that is, let's say, a natural hazard of essentially going up the bridge perhaps. So this anyway, what to me was tremendously interesting was when I was reading the history of man, that to me seemed exactly what was archetypally being explored analogously with these other creatures. And I mean, to me, it could be that what I'm talking about is the analogy, and there really is this symbolic reptilian artifact that is part of sort of the appraisal of one's own physiology, which is a necessary sort of functional metaphor in the appraisal of one's own anatomy. That is, I think, somewhat of a genetic we call it perhaps a genetic witness or a genetic inheritance or something like that. Um, sorry, when I didn't mean to say inheritance, I meant to say also intelligence, a genetic inherited intelligence in some sense. And in some sense, it seems that it is because in some sense it is a kind of a synthesis that is well, on a mess level is the collaboration of two sort of source codes or something like that, and in the amalgamation and encoding of that into a single vessel or something like that. But the under, I guess I'm speculating as to a materialist substrate here, but I mean, I'm not allergic to the idea that the genetic entity is a heritable, independent witness. But it is almost strange that it itself seems to be this chronic helper itself, within the motif of the helper in the genetic entity. Uh, that it is one side of a sort of a chronic process of mitosis between the fusion of Thetan and GE itself. And in some sense, I see that archetypally as being fundamental to the dispersal of faith itself. The sorry for themselves, greed of others dichotomy. And those are both of those two sentiments, sorry for themselves, implies more than one, and greed of others, S with an S, others, other to oneself, implies either could apply to each the Thetan and the genetic entity between themselves. And so which one should feel sorry for themselves and which one is projecting onto the other one the greed of others? And in some sense, the one implies the other, but it's also, I think I have called this the independent dichotomy, because they're not tacitly codependent on the one requiring the other. Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to say that I need to re-go over all the dichotomies because I have confused myself about all the dichotomies. I made a very laborious recording where I treated each one in turn, and I believe I resolved their particular dynamic of potential trouble. And so I'm I'm due for a refresher, and I have probably just even said something that is not correct. So yeah, I need to recapitulate a treatise on the dichotomy and write it out nicely for myself. In fact, I did write it out nicely the last time, but I need to refresh myself and then re-evaluate perhaps. So that's on my to-do list. Which has now sort of become more prescient now that I have sort of updated it with a let's say, this broader review and this broader perspective on the green sequence and the red sequence. Um, and also there's an other kind of interesting speculation that I have moved into, which is I think, and now this is such an embarrassing thing to even say, that because I have not thoroughly, I mean, I have from time to time been exposed to the Scientology data on overts, withholds, and um, motivators and such, but it's never sat with me that nicely. Not because the mechanics that are explained are incorrect, they're certainly workable, but just that to me they didn't seem systematized in a way in which that my model could kind of conceive of them, and in some sense, I think that they couldn't be modeled in that useful a way so as to completely ground a concept of workable justice. I mean, in some sense, my complaint about keeping Scientology working not being objectively justifiable is somewhat the case in point, that it needs to sort of be able to synthesize into that kind of nuance and subtle kind of understanding, um, which is perhaps missing in the field, maybe. I don't know. Again, I'd have to check on this, but so I would like to refine that, because I do think I have a tentative solution to that, which is a very strange model, but in some sense, I think, and I don't need to do this model, but this model would be something of one of the ways to sort of very see the red, uh, the readily applicable application of my modeling and my theory in the field of Scientology, and finding a way to bridge my theory with Scientology, and also to make amends to some of, I won't say the holes in the field of Scientology, because in some sense, it does achieve what it promises to achieve, but I do think that there is a lack of, in some sense, it's not a robust uh, answer to, in some sense, I don't know how to put this. It doesn't have the, I can only, it doesn't have the strategic might. Uh, there is something like, functionally speaking, it's all fine. It really is. But strategically, uh, there are lapses. I mean, I can give very good sort of analogies and examples of this. I mean, the recent South African history is a perfect example of this. Inasmuch as Scientology has quite the correct aim to remove psychiatry from society, and at least remove it from having power over people in any kind of legal sense, and in some sense also that kind of avails the problem of the law itself and the weakness of the law itself, and the weakness of public morality in some sense, and ethics in the culture as a whole, but also the field of psychology itself being filled with crazy bunk and philosophical insanity, and so many denigrating and horrible things that are frankly, based on very brittle forms of pseudo-intellectualism and amoral depravity. Um, so if we just understand that psychology is dangerous, obviously Scientology understands this very well. But there still is a problem because psychology as a field has its history, it has its culture, it has its practices, and it has embedded itself within the legal structure, within the political structure, within the soft powers of the world. It's spoken of in the academy in high regard, perhaps, or maybe not so high regard, but it still gets away with itself. So it's this kind of strange sort of whipping boy. Well, actually, because psychology is so malformed, then anyone can get away with anything to some degree. It's kind of like the idea, well, everyone in the philosophy department is in their different school of thinking, and there's no agreement, and there's only controversy, so anything goes then. It's like the Wild West. So in some sense, I don't wish to be sympathetic to psychologists and to the field of psychology, but just for a matter in the way of argument, let's allow ourselves to test the waters of being intellectually sympathetic to psychology. And if we test the waters of being sympathetic to psychology, they will say we're doing our best. We're just trying to do our best, and we're just trying to treat these symptoms, and these are the only things that seem to make the symptoms abate. And so this is our standard practice, or something like that, that anything else would actually do something worse, or something like that. Well, in some sense you need to say, well, please explain to me in the most bootstrapped way possible, in the most in the most precise and clear of terms, how you got to that conclusion, and show me all your evidence and show me all your reasoning, so that I can have a look at that and then explain to you why you've got it all wrong, and explain to you how you can do something completely different and get much better results. So in some sense you can substitute for psychology instead of just disagreeing with it. Now, in disagreeing with psychology, the real problem here is that we have perhaps found a way to let it adapt and evolve itself to disguising its malfeasance better, or legally extracting better forms of permission and embedding itself more deeply into the society, that in some sense you can win battles against psychology. And I do think that we will win the war against them, but how are we in actually strategically, completely overcoming them? And I would say that, and I would look at South Africa as a perfect example of this. Thabo Mbeki was removed from office effectively because of a social uprising to some degree, a treatment action campaign, a social movement under the banner of the TRC, or TAC, the Treatment Action Campaign. And they got their way. They got Thabo Mbeki removed from office. Even when he conceded he was wrong, even when he changed the policy, they still kicked him out. They did it for vengeance, because he was wrong. And then what did we get? We got Jacob Zuma. And we got full-blown institutionalized corruption. So we kicked out the guy who actually admitted his mistake, because we just wanted to be angry and to be fed up. And what did we get? We got a much worse situation. And that's what happens when you're not willing to let me help you help yourself. for the good of all, in some sense, so that we can actually get past this evil in some sense. Let me help you to novate your field into complete reformation, which it so requires in order to not commit any more human rights atrocities and abuses and human experimentation. And disintegrated, misunderstanding of the entire field as well. So, and this is slightly problematic because Scientology, I don't think in its current form has the capacity to do that. Scientology might even be able to offer better services and things like that. But can it, in a secular way, justify? Some sense it can just say, well, look at our results, maybe. But in an academic fashion, and yes, academics 1.5 on the tone scale or something like that. But why can't you, on that level of the tone, I mean, yes, it's like it's under 2, I get that. But why can't you come up with a 1.5 put down of the field and a substitution of the field that is at 1.5 an arrow pointing upwards saying respect the Republic at 3.0? Why can't you at least do that? Why can't we make a field that is a 1.5 field that points up and says respect the Republic? We need something that operates at 1.5 that respects the Republic at 3.0. I don't think that is beyond the pale. I think that strategically is what we need. That is what psychology needs to do, to strategically obviate psychology, or at least obviate its out ethics. And that in some sense does require perhaps working with psychology enough to replicate its own internal misunderstanding, so that then it can sort of create a bridge towards that misunderstanding and those incorrect premises and those stupid assumptions and those out ethics, sort of mechanisms that are just kind of accepted as part of the craft or whatever it is. Because in some sense, psychiatry especially is essentially it's a form of witchcraft. I put a diagnosis on you and then the court will do with you as I command. I mean, if that's not witchcraft, I don't know what is. And then if you say, well, we'll justify your diagnosis. Ooh, chemical names, chemical sounds, chemical labels, chemical knowledges. I know so much about chemicals. And look what I have derived from these fancy labels and these fancy words and these formulas. Believe me, Mr. Judge, I know what I'm talking about. All these chemical sounding chemicals. Everything is chemicals. And the judge says, well, let me check my legal structure. Let me check my legal theory. Does it tell me that chemicals is more important than legal dignity and legal integrity and legal subjectivity and constitutional rights? Well, I guess your diagnosis works on me today because all the chemicals sound more important than all of these legal theory concerns. So I guess you are the king, Mr. Psychiatrist. You are the false authority to rule us all. I hope you don't say that I've got a chemical problem, because then I would have to be under your care as well. And this is how the false authority of the world creeps into these things, because we have abandoned the stricture of morality proper. Anyway, so for me, it's always been 2 things. It's been the hard legal power or legal structure in society has to get right, and the soft knowledge of psychology has to be rectified and reformed. And then we can finally have a society in which the power structure can be worthy of trust, of a high trust, and the republic can be ensured in some sense. And to a large extent, a lot of the proto-fascist philosophy and political corruption and cultural degeneration has been in the name of psychological language that has come to back up this kind of moral sympathy extraction that has come to substitute for morality in a idea that identity as a collective identity is the source of moral consideration and moral integrity for the individual. And that is how people that create diagnoses, which are in some sense a kind of categorical identity, have been able to plug themselves into this disgusting neo-fascistic kind of moral organization. I mean, in some sense, that is the trick of diagnosis in psychology, and in some sense, maybe we do need to have something called diagnosis, but we need to also understand that diagnosis should not have a parallel correlate to justice and to legal theory. Legal theory needs to be independently substantiated from its own premises, from its own subject. That must always be seen to supersede other theory. And in this way, we can even say that the soft power and knowledge in psychology that needs to come out at some point will not be able to compel people to take their medicine, that we will still have secular freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of organization, all these sorts of things. That people will even have the freedom to not take the best advice on their mental health, because that is, but obviously we do have to have some, not that we need an orthodoxy, but we need real, true knowledge on the subject of psychology. Otherwise, we are prone to false authority. Otherwise, we are prone to having that soft power corrupted against the individual, which it has been. And you can see that quite plainly in the maladministration of the state of South Africa, and at the same time the institutionalized corruption, which is in the judiciary itself, has corrupted the legal theory, as the political arena has so too been corrupted, as it engages in what is essentially this kind of proto-fascism and proto-fascist moral catering and pandering to people on the level of sort of selling them their identity and all that sort of stuff. So what's the point? Anyway, I need to go over these dichotomies again. Maybe I'll make a separate recording for that after I've got my notes together on that. But yeah, I was going to talk more about myself and saying that the strange model that I have, I guess, about trying to bridge overts, withholds. Withholds, I think, are much more simple. Overts and deads and deads and or D, I don't know how they're pronounced verbally. DED, deserved actions, which then are essentially the effects of motivators, but the effects came before the motivator. So you've got this Now you see, like the DED motivator confusion, I think, is better symbolized by the motivator in some sense. This is ambiguous as well, so I think it actually goes both ways. But essentially, I think you can, in some sense, in this technical breakdown that I'm kind of envisioning, and this is going to be like complete babble, me going through this, but essentially, I think what it would be like is, so the first model that I'm going to give is actually completely incorrect, but it's just a way to kind of get away to explaining the whole setup. But essentially, the dead is the DED is like a broken KRC, and the motivator therefore is being projected from the dead as in some sense is motivator is being projected after the fact of the dead as being a virtual preceding broken ARC that was causal post hoc to the development of the dead, but obviously the dead happened first. So the dead becomes, in some sense, when I say a broken KRC, it's not even broken, it's more like an inverted KRC. So in some sense, that inverted KRC is inverted because it has inside of it an upside down broken ARC. So it is like it's not a broken KRC, it's an inverted KRC, but it itself is not inverted, it's the right side up, but it contains the seed of an upside down broken ARC as its premise. And in that sense, it has a myriad substructure which is ambiguous to lay out, because in some sense, and I mean this in quite a technical way, and this might be too much of a projection, because in some sense this is much better described, I think, in my field circuits and my model of field circuits. But if you could do something like if you put a triangle within a triangle, and the big triangle is KRC and the small triangle is ARC, then you've got 4 triangles inside there. And the fourth one right in the center is in some sense this broken ARC, which is being projected by what I'm titling as an inverted KRC triangle, because it contains the seed of this broken ARC as its sort of core matrix. And then the 3 triangles that are made around the broken ARC as the center 4th triangle are strange triangles, because they're strange because they involve in each corner one of the objects, one of the points of intersection of the KRC triangle, but then the other 2 edges of that triangle are not some other points in the KRC triangle. They're 2 other points of the ARC triangle. So, and in some sense, I think that this also is ambiguous, because if that configuration fails, you can just as easily, let's say, rotate the internal triangle to make new triangles in each corner. Now, I'm just trying to think mathematically. This is embarrassing. Let me just rotate it once in my mind. So if you rotated it once, that would be a new thing. And if you rotated it once more, yeah, so you could rotate it three times and get all new. Yeah, so there are those those 3 corner triangles have 3 different permutations, each of them. So in some sense, there are 3 sets. And between those 3 sets, there are a total of, in each set, that there are 3 sub-triangles. but in some sense the broken ARC that they symbolize are all the same. So that's also why there's an ambiguity in some sense, because in some sense the broken ARC that it's projecting on the other person is a stable broken ARC, or it has a stable signature, although there are three different ways to skin this cat, and in some sense in each of those ways there are three uh, procedural steps. Okay. Now, each of those three procedural steps are themselves quite toxic because they have. See, I've already gone through so much technical complexity, but sadly, the whole thing is even much more complex than this because, in some sense, I think that it isn't just the big KRC triangle. You could also have a big ARC triangle with a KRC inside of it that's broken. So the dead, in some sense, could also invert itself completely in and become an ARC, a big ARC with a small KRC, a broken KRC inside of it. So that it could say, no, 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 you have a broken KRC, instead of saying you have a broken ARC. So in some sense, when you say to someone, you have a broken ARC, you're gaslighting them. But when you tell people that you have a broken KRC, you're not in fact gaslighting them, you're steel manning them potentially. Or they might say that you're straw manning them, but then, then they have the right to, I mean, as long as you're giving them space to reply to what you're saying, I don't think people can actually argue, I don't think people can really be resentful. I mean, they might say you're straw manning me because X, Y, Z, and then go into it, but they better not just they better not just say, oh, you're straw manning me, full stop. That's the end of it, because that's not an answer. Well, in some sense, it is an answer. It's an answer of in like, I don't want to have this conversation because your replication of what I've just said is so patently, sort of unserious that like you obviously are not capable of having a real intellectual debate if you're going to involve yourself in that level of straw manning. So I mean, I obviously it would be a competent answer if that were the attitude behind it. At least then it would be a self-consistent, competent answer, um, essentially, if that were the implication. But anyway, so it is more complicated than just there being a KRC with a broken ARC inside of it. It could be the opposite. In some sense, the what I was heading as an inverted KRC, because it has a broken ARC inside of it, is something like what narcissistic abuse is, and the inversion of that entire setup, which is what then I would probably call as a heading an inverted ARC triangle with a broken KRC seed inside of it. In some sense, that seed is what you would have to sort of anchor into somebody else's identity, would be what I would generally think of as borderline abuse. Like that would be the kind of abuse and sadistically edged sort of covert hostility that borderlines would perpetrate on against people. And then the thing that's confusing about all of this is that people often use both. By the way, narcissists can use both and borderlines can use both. But what's even worse than that is that the subcomponents of the triangle aren't necessarily all present. And you can play a lot of games like that, is that you could essentially only use one triangle and then kind of use the other two triangles in the other corners as a kind of dialectical. Um, and when I say use them as a kind of dialectical, I mean that you wouldn't actually want them to be, you wouldn't want the other person to catch on that they could use the other 2 points as a dialectical, because then at least then you would be able to kind of contract the other person's position into a stability, into a kind of static, in which then you could force them to play the role in this infernal drama of this whole setup, which they wouldn't want to do. So they don't want the other person to make a dialectic of the remaining two. So often what they will do is they will try to conflate two of the triangles and force the other person to embody or to enact or to be enforced to kind of provide compliance in the third triangle and to play that role, because what is being intimated at them, or what is being performatively engaging against them, is the other two triangles. Now, in some sense, the reason why I think there is a rightful term to be called benign narcissism is because, in some sense, I think that this is even a natural form. You could call it sticky communication or something like that. This can be a natural form of subtly broadcasting. I mean, if it's done consciously, not if it's done unconsciously. But if it's done in a benign way, if it's done, because in some sense people can portray beliefs to other people that they do not have a fixed commitment to, because they have a fixed commitment to their principled intellectual values and ethics. And to them it doesn't matter in what form the belief takes. It only matters to them that we get into exploring and let's say attaining to a single faith about the principle of the matter, so that maybe we can align our purposes and orientate ourselves to have, let's say, a strategy that is more effective at being efficacious on the level of our shared values and principles. So it can either be in trying to find a way to forge agreement on the level of principle, or to find find consensus, or at least find the areas of disagreement, so as to apply communication and persuasion and negotiation, and maybe even a mutual novation on the issue itself. It's not as if only one party can learn and the other party needs to be taught or something like that. Both can learn and both can be taught. Both can teach, both can learn from the exchange from the other. So it wasn't clear that, because by well, anyway. See, when I said both there, I in some sense took it as read. I took it as the implication that both is not a collective noun. Both is a reference to two individuals. So I kind of already assumed that there would be a duplication of that sort of fundamental, almost principal datum to contextualize, because in some sense there is no such thing as stable beliefs. Beliefs are always contextual to the context of their conveyance, which in some sense is contextual to the faith in which they are animated, the intuition that is evaluating them, the quality and the condition of the mind that is working on them. And so I do think that there's a huge amount of ability to when connecting with this. I do think that there's a huge amount of edification that happens if there's just a decent ability to talk about delicate matters. There's a huge amount of trust that is inculcated in being able to, in a sophisticated, nuanced way, hash out differences of view and different perspectives and different understandings on very tricky topics, in which everyone is liable to misspeak, and also everyone is liable to have their views refined um, in a respectful way. Obviously, that can't be facilitated in a respectful way if there isn't, let's say, a readily available capacity to have some charity of faith, as it were, to have some shared good faith that it's possible, to have your views fully heard, to have your take fully weighed and measured carefully and seriously, um, to have the truth of it weighed carefully and seriously, um, and to hear, it in conjunction perhaps with other contrasted perspectives, but I mean also in a manner in which, you know, perhaps there are methods and there are ways to distilling, the sort of the most extreme cases on both sides, and then how to, kind of systematize the complexity of it, so that we can more stably work out how to navigate and traverse, the tricky terrain. Um, but also, it's very useful to know how to be able to convince people of a different persuasion as well. So, doing it in a systemic way, and also doing it, sort of reproving it in the conversational dialogue form, can also have its merits and its value and its own separate kind of reward, in terms of being able to better promote and publicize perhaps a more sane view, and also perhaps generate a better consensus on some of these issues. Anyway, there was a point that I wanted to say about myself, about trust. Yeah, I mean, the state of trust that I have, I guess, is frankly not very good, and in some sense, a lot of that is in reference, I guess, just to the instability of my own sort of messed state, I guess. But it doesn't trouble me, I guess. But I mean, in some sense, it's frankly just a residue of uh, sort of necessary trepidation and affliction, and sort of the right amount of consciousness over one's own capacity of being troubled by untoward and dangerous forces, uh, of which there are many in these troubling times. And something also, not living in a high trust society, essentially, but also in my immediate circumstances, not living in a state of tranquility and serenity. But so anyway, yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of what would it be, auditing on the subject of trust. Anyway, I mean, just I keep on thinking about the incidents around that, and in some sense, I don't even see them as incidents that trouble me. It's just sort of reflected in my immediate uh, evaluation of the suboptimal frustration or aggravating factors, uh, frustration about the aggravating factors that impede the speed of my continued uh, development of my research, but also because of the general seriousness of the general degeneration within my culture and such. So all those things are very troubling to me. And I guess I've just always, it actually does knock me back whenever I feel impeded on that line. Because in some sense it's just a sort of reminder of living in at least a condition, or living within a kind of a condition in terms of my messed state, um, in which I'm situated, which is fundamentally unsound. In some sense, it's like that. When I say it's unsound, I don't mean my mess condition. I mean the mess condition of my environment, which is in some sense keeps on reminding me of how much without honor, of how much dishonor is latent within it, but also the dishonor of I don't wish to make explicit complaints about specific incidents, but and these are quite. It's, you see, it's not a question of forgiveness. It's just a question of the fundamental dishonor uh, of the way in which I'm impeded. It's a very deep and dark conundrum. I don't like meditating on it, But it also makes me think that, well, if I just don't meditate on it, that doesn't fundamentally resolve the inhibition, which is in some sense, again, to me, greatly representative of this sort of this theme of the dishonor uh, of those that would be my kindred, perhaps those which I perhaps own allegiance to, but then they dishonor me. So it's this stigma. The stigmatization of this is very aberrative to me, but the problem has always been that this is not an incident. This aberration is a present time problem, as far as I have evaluated it at least. And perhaps the incidents that are reflected in this present time problem would themselves lift if the present time problem were resolved in some sense. And I mean, I'm very sensitive to not wishing to extract sympathy, but this is really not about sympathy extraction on my part. This is about me not wishing to witness what I sadly think is just this subject of a general dishonorable environment. I guess when I say environment, I'm saying field. And I've never I haven't dwelled too much on this, on trying to actually solve this problem. Also because of perhaps my fundamental problem with trust. I do, I think, have something of some kind of incidents to do with trust and broken trust. And I think that those subjects are I guess with those, I mean, in some sense, it's a form of dead. It's weird that I sort of, but I don't. I've never quite understood exactly everything implied by dead, because can you have a dead against your own, a DED against your own dynamic, your own other dynamic, by one dynamic to another dynamic? Because in some sense, I did it all for the fourth dynamic. And I really don't believe that I'm trying to get other people to sort of, by some overt measure, inculcate some sort of sympathetic motivator for my course of action, but just the general level of invalidation in some sense. And I guess that is, this sort of this kind of messiah complex narcissism is something that I'm very kind of conscious that I shouldn't, sort of appertain to that level of toxic resentment and sort of narcissistic I do think that my narcissism is benign, in as much as that anyone can be said to um, perpetrate a benign narcissism, which I do think is a valid sort of thing, and I can even point to it exactly where it exists in my models, as it were. But in some sense, I do think that it might be internally balanced between what I've called the narcissistic gateway filter between the subconscious and the unconscious, which is something like, um, can I even put it in that language? Let me think. I'll have to think about that. In some sense, that division in Scientology is only understood in terms of the different fields of processing that develops. And in some sense, creative processing is directly dealing with the unconscious side of the mind. Um, Postular processing is somewhat, I think, on the ego side of things, um, and also has a bit of an effect on the subconscious. And the subconscious, in some sense, would be like book one auditing, the idea that everything happens to you and you just develop beliefs in response to it. But there's a reason why book one auditing, I think, is right at the start, which is that essentially book one is tending to the subconscious, and then I would say from Science of Survival to Handbook for Pre-Clears, I think you're kind of in the process of synthesizing enough complexity around the issue of responsibility, around the theta mest theory, and because there's also an implicit sort of asymmetry within the theta mest theory, because theta directs mest, and when it happens the other way, then it's definitely sort of aberrative in some sense. Um, and therefore, in some sense, um, even relative to theta, if um, every problem is in some sense then reducible to n theta, um, at least on the level of resolving it in the realm of the ego, but in the realm of the unconscious itself, in the realm of creative processing, there is no definitive resolution. There's only kind of like tentative, hypothetical, um, theoretical, uh, you can understand that there's a potency or there is a way that it can be resolved, but in some sense there are no stable datums in that, in some sense, in that view of the bank. In some sense, the subconscious, unconscious, and ego are all the bank, but in some sense, the ego is in present time. The unconscious is generally is good to understand the unconscious as being like the main. I mean, book one is so small compared to the rest of the line of development of the entire field. Um, but in some sense, there is a rift between even book one and Science of Survival, and the reason why that rift needs to somewhat be there, and in some sense, when you go through the tech this way, also it's de facto happening that you are closing off the subconscious, which needs to be closed off in order to develop the unconscious and the ego. And this is something of a natural progression. This is part of the natural development of the psyche, and maturation is at different stages of your life. I do think it does take a tremendous duration to actually grow through this. I mean, I can't be the perfect model of this, because I was developing the research for this as I was doing it, which is not ideal. So, but I mean, I know physiologically, brains are developing in the mid-20s. So, and I do think that in some sense the brain has to probably finish growing, and then you also have to wait for it to settle in some sense. So, it's just because you've stopped growing doesn't mean that then your brain is completely done. Then it sort of needs to sort of settle. I mean, I'm 34 years old, and I think I only self-actualized this year. But I don't know about the state of my brain in terms of the development from when I was 27 to now. I mean, I think I had a pretty serious brain scan when I was 28, so in the future it might be interesting to compare structures and such. But anyway, but just based on, sort of neurological biology, um, and in some sense that might be something of an artifact of just how hard it is to mature in the current culture, in the current state of society. So, I mean, you can't, I mean, because the brain is such a plastic sort of thing, you might have a much more efficacious form of human development if, sort of development and values and pedagogy, education were properly in place at a younger age. Anyway, let me stop speculating, but I think I've gone through enough on this sort of subject. So anyway,